piece of Next.js that is large and complicated. Everything else we're going to be covering after this section is relatively small or niche. So this is the final difficult thing to really cover that you're going to use often, and that is data mutation. We've talked a lot about how you can fetch data, how caching works, and now we're going to be talking about how you can mutate and update that data. And the main thing you're going to be using for that is something called server actions, which is what this video is all about. Let's take a look at this code really quickly here. As you can see, I have this get to-dos function, which just does a fetch request and gets an array of all of our to-dos. We're using that inside of this page here. And then inside of this page at the very bottom, we're listing out all of the to-dos. In our case, we have 3 to-dos on our list. And then if we go a little above that, we have a form. This form just has some styles on it, so it doesn't look super ugly. And then you can see here we have an input with the name of title. That is this input right here. And then I have a button that allows me to add. But this form currently doesn't do anything. When I click on it, right now it's just not doing anything. It's making a GET request essentially to our page. Instead, what we want to do is we want to make a mutation to our data and add whatever we type into here to our list of to-dos. Now, normally, if you're doing this in plain old React, you would just set up an onSubmit event handler inside of here. Then you would set up maybe a function inside of here that handles it, or maybe you'd do something inside of a use effect, but you would do all of this on the client side. Well, with Next.js, you can actually write all of your code just in a server component, so you don't even have to worry about touching the client at all with any client components, and I'll show you exactly how you do that. The first thing you're going to do is you're going to use an action instead. Now, if you're used to forms inside of just normal HTML, you may know that an action allows you to pass essentially the URL you want to go to, so like /new/to-do or something like that. But inside of Next.js and React, it actually allows you to pass a function, and this function is going to get called. We can pass along something called a server action. And these server actions are functions that we can write that are going to run on the server for us. So this action acts exactly the same as just running a function in line, but that function actually runs on the server. And the way this works is because Next.js behind the scenes is making a fetch request for you. So let me show you exactly what I'm talking about. I'm just going to come in here with an action, and I'm going to just say console.log server action, just like that. Now, immediately when I try to do this, you're going to notice we get an error on the side, and this is actually a very handy error. You can see it says functions cannot be passed directly to client components unless you explicitly mark it by using use server. So this is something that's really important to note about server actions, is that you must mark the function you're using as a server function. So that way Next.js knows that it is not client code at all. Let's create a brand new function up here. We'll just call this create to do. And for now, we won't pass anything into it, and all we're just going to put inside of here is a console log that says create to do. And the important thing is I want to make this a server action. So to do that, I just put use server at the very top of this function. Now this function has been marked as a server action, which means I can use it inside this action prop here. Let's go ahead and we're just going to pass in that create to do function. There we go. Give that a quick save. Now you'll notice we'll get another really important error. This one says server actions must be asynchronous functions. So we must make this an async function. And the reason that they must be asynchronous is because essentially what's happening is Next.js is doing a fetch request, and fetch requests are asynchronous. So now we've made it asynchronous, we've marked it as use server. So now if we give this a save, you'll notice we now no longer have any errors. And if I start typing something inside of here, I'm going to go inspect my page, go to the console, I'm going to click add. You'll notice as I'm clicking add, it's not doing any weird refreshes. And you'll also notice there's nothing being printed inside my console. And that's because it's actually calling this code on the server. So if we look inside of our server console log, you'll notice it has create to do inside of here. So if I restart my server and I click the button again, you'll notice that it prints out create to do every single time I click the button. You can see every time I click it, it's printing out create to do. And the reason this is working, if we inspect and we go to the network tab and I just click this button, you'll notice it's actually making a network request. And if we look inside the payload here, you can see it's passing along my title, as well as a bunch of other information that's like Next.js specific. So Next.js essentially is creating its own endpoint, and it's giving a bunch of information up so that it can hook up your endpoint that it's creating with the actual server action you're passing along. So essentially, Next.js is doing a bunch of magic behind the scenes to make a fetch request that directly calls this function right here with all of the data from your form. It passes that in the form of a form data object, which is of the type form data. So we can just get that form data like this. And now what I can do is I can console.log our form data. And if we just click add here, you'll notice it prints out a bunch of information. But the important thing is we have this name title with a value that we typed in right here. That's because form data allows us to get specific things. We could say get, I want to get the title, and now that's going to get me whichever HTML input element has the name of title. So now if we just click add, you'll notice it's printing out whatever I have typed in this field. If I type in A, click add, you can see it's printing out A right here. So now that we've seen how we can hook up this server action, let's actually go ahead and write this server action so it does our fetch request to create a to-do. I'm just going to copy over all of this code. This fetch right here is going to be slightly changed because the method here is going to be a post request, and then we need to pass along some body. So we'll say json.stringify. And essentially all we want to do is just take our title and pass that in. And this is coming from form data.get. And we want to get that title property right here. Our completed is going to be false. And that should be all that we need to pass into this. What I'm going to do is I'm going to remove this line that actually takes the data portion. I'm going to say const data is equal to awaiting this. Make sure I spell const correctly. There we go. Now you can see we're making a fetch request to essentially create a brand new to-do with this specific title. And I'll just console.log the data that is being returned to us from this fetch request. So let's come in here. I'm going to type in the title new, click add, and you'll notice it's returning to us a brand new object with the ID of 4. Now this is technically not correct, and that's because I just forgot to pass along the headers here. So if I pass in the content type of JSON, I'm essentially telling this that I'm creating a JSON object instead. Now if I go into my database and I remove that number 4 that was created by accident, there we go, and I just do a quick refresh to my page so that everything is completely fresh. Now I'm going to type in new and click add. You can see it's returning to us a brand new to-do with the title of new and completed false and an ID of 4. You will notice on the right side of our screen, nothing over there updates. So we've made a fetch request. This fetch request has gone along, called this create to do function. It's made another fetch request that actually calls our API to create this to do. And now we're just logging out that data on the server, but we're never going ahead and refreshing our client. If I manually refresh, you will notice that it still doesn't show up. And again, that's because of the cache. But if I do a hard refresh to clear all the caching, you will see that that new shows up right there. Now, obviously, all of these problems are to do with the fact that we are caching everything, so we essentially just need to clear the cache for this particular element. What we can do here, instead of console logging this data, we can just do a simple revalidate path, and we're at the home path. We can just revalidate this current path. That should be all that we need to do, and we don't even need this data, so I can remove this up here. Now, if we give this a quick save, I type in another, and I click add, you'll notice that this now shows up right here, which is perfect. So by revalidating my path, Next.js has said, okay, this path has changed. It goes ahead and it reruns the fetch up here to get our to-dos, and it automatically replaces this content with the new to-dos, which includes this another right here. And the important thing is that all of the code that I've written is inside of a server component. As you can see, I don't have any use client at the top of my code, no use clients anywhere. I just have a server component here with my form inside of it. And then up here, I have my server action, as well as just a function to get my information. Now, the really important thing is if you have your code set up like this, it actually works with progressive enhancement, which means if you have JavaScript disabled, this form will still actually work, which is great. If I come in here and I inspect my page and I just want to disable JavaScript, so I can come in here, I can say JavaScript, disable JavaScript, there we go. That should disable JavaScript on the page. If I refresh, type something in, click add, you'll notice it still works. Instead, it's just doing a hard refresh on my page though to make sure that everything is working. But I have no JavaScript running and this still works just fine, which is really cool. Now, this is the most basic way that you can define a server action, and it works great if you're working inside of a server component. Also, just a side note, I re-enabled JavaScript in my browser just so everything else is going to be working just fine because most people have JavaScript enabled. What happens if you want to use a server action inside of a client component? Let's go ahead and we're just going to clean up our database real quick. We're going to get rid of all this stuff that we added. We're just going to bring it down to essentially just these two to-dos. Go. So now if I do a hard refresh, we just have those two to-dos in our list, just so we have a little bit smaller list to work with. Let's say that what I want to do is I want to take this entire form and I want to move it into a client component for some particular reason. What I'm going to do is come into here. I'll create a brand new folder. We'll call this components. We'll come in here. We'll say to do form.tsx, export that to do form. There we go. I'll just return this information and I want to use that create to do. So what I do, I'll just come inside of here. I'll copy this entire create to do and I'll move it inside of here. So we'll paste that down just like this and we'll make sure we import. There we go. So now all of that is working. And if we come into here, we say to do form, everything should be working exactly as it was before, but now I've just moved this into its own file. As we can see, everything is still working. So now let's go ahead and actually make this into a client component because you'll notice this title doesn't actually get cleared out when I submit my form, and I probably want to clear that out. So what I could do inside of this action is actually run a function that'll do that for me. So inside of here, I'm going to run this. I'm going to get my create to do just like that. I'm going to await the create to do, make this asynchronous. And then what I'm going to do, make sure I close off all of my stuff, get the form data from here, pass that along just like that. And then finally, I want to make sure I clear out this input, so we can use a ref for that. So we'll say ref input ref dot current dot value is equal to an empty string const input ref equals use ref. There we go. And this is an HTML input element. There we go. And let's just make sure that I check to see if this current value exists. So input ref dot current is not equal to null. Then we're going to do the code over here. We'll just put a little if check. There we go. Perfect. So now we're going to be getting some errors. First of all, that's because we need to turn this into a client component to use our client hooks. So we'll say use client. Now if we save, you'll notice we're still getting errors. And you can see right here, it is not allowed to define inline use server annotated server actions inside of a client component. Essentially, we cannot use this server action inside of a client component. And the reason for that makes a lot of sense. Let's say that I was importing some code to actually call my database inside this client component. Well, I would have to make an import statement in here to import my database information, and then that would be inside my client component, even though I'm only actually using it on the server, and the actual line between server and client gets really blurry. So as soon as you jump over to that client boundary, nothing can happen at all server related. So instead, I need to take this and I need to move it outward. One particular option I could do is move it to a parent, which is a server component. So in our case, we have here this get to do's function and this page right here. This page is technically a server component. So what we could do is we could define this function up here, and then we can pass that down. So we could say create to do is equal to create to do, just like that. So now passing this down into our to do form, we can take in create to do just like this. And we have create to do, and we can actually type this out. Now the particular type for this function is going to be a little bit interesting because essentially it's just a function that takes in form data. So we can say that this is going to be a function that takes in form data, just like that. And it's going to return to us a promise with no result at all. Give that a quick save. That got rid of all of our errors. So let's save this as well. And let's see if this change made everything work. So we're just going to come over here, I'll type in new and I'll click add, and you'll notice this added the new element right here. So the thing I wanted to demonstrate with this is if you're trying to use a server action, but you have a client component, which is something that's really common. For example, the reason we made this a client component is to clear out this title input every single time we submit something, which as you can see here is working just fine, but we cannot use the server action directly inside this file. We can't create it here. Instead, we need to create it inside of some other server component and then pass it down as a prop. This is something that's really interesting because normally you cannot pass functions as props to a client component from a server component because you can only pass down things that are serializable, things like strings, dates, booleans, and so on. But server actions are a special function inside of Next.js that they allow you to pass down between server and client because all it's doing is doing a fancy fetch request behind the scenes. So Next.js is smart enough just to hook these different things up for you automatically. Now, sometimes though, it doesn't make a lot of sense to actually pass down your server action from a server component, because let's say this to-do form is like 30 levels nested deep inside of client components, it would be a ton of prop drilling, which is obviously not ideal. Or maybe you just want to use this same function in a bunch of different places. Well, instead what you can do is you can actually take this out and move it into its own file. Let's come in here and we'll create a folder called actions, and we'll create another file inside of here called todos.ts. Now I'm going to export a function here. Let's just paste it down. We're going to export this. Now we have our create to do function inside of here. Make sure we import revalidate path. And since we're doing essentially only actions, server actions inside this file, we can take this use server and actually move it to the very top of our file. And what this is telling Next.js is that every single function we export from here is a server action. So of course they must be asynchronous and they must make sure they take in this form data like this. So now if I just come over here, instead of passing this down, I just import this directly inside my to-do form. So we'll just clean up all of our code here. Then inside of our to-do form, instead of actually getting this passed into the props, we'll just import it up here. So I can just come down here, automatically import that, and now this will work as well. If we say another, and we click add, you can see that that shows up on the list. Now the reason this works is again because of something special with Next.js. It allows you to import server actions into a client component as long as you're importing them from another file. You can't create them in the same file, but you can import them from another file, just like how you can pass them down as props. It's a fancy thing that Next.js lets you do. Normally, you cannot import server code into client code, but it allows you to actually do that import because of the fact that they're server actions, and Next.js just hooks up everything behind the scenes. So if you want to use server actions, there are 3 ways you can do it. The first is just defining the server action inline inside of whatever the actual function is that you are creating this, but it must be a server component where you're defining this server action. If you want to use a client component, you essentially have 2 options. You can either pass it down as a prop, or you can define it in a separate file and then import that into the client component. Now, another important thing to understand about this server action is I don't have to pass my form data along to it. For example, I could just pass along the title. So I could say get title, and I could pass just this along to my create to do. So here I could change this to be title, which is a string, just like that, and then use my title right here. This is going to work just fine as well. I just need to make sure that I cast the type of this, because right now formData.get can return to me a form data entry or null. So if I cast this to a string, I'm essentially telling TypeScript, hey, I know this is going to be a string, so just let it through. So now if I give that a quick save, this will work just fine as well. We'll just type in a bunch of random strings, click add, and you can see that new element showed up. Now, the final thing I want to talk about in relation to server actions before we dive into the future videos that cover kind of more niche server action related concepts is going to be how they work with using closures. So I'm going to clean up my database again a little bit just so we have a lot less to look at. We'll just look at these 2 items, give this a hard refresh. You can see we just have those 2 items now, which is great. Now, what I want to do is actually talk about how server actions work with closures. So I'm going to change up this code quite a bit by making it so that our form is back inside of our server component. So we're going to come into here to our server component. We're going to paste in our form. We're going to get rid of all of the actual client related code because this is something you only have to worry about when you're working with server actions specifically inside of server components. So I'm going to get create to do, pass it in just like this. There we go. I'm going to bring our create to do directly back into the file we were just working in. So it's going to be inside of here. There we go. Get rid of this import since we don't need it, and make sure here I put use server. So we know that this is a server component, and this is going to be taking in form data. I'm just going to be getting this back to essentially the simplest example that we possibly had. So this is form data.get title. There we go. So now if we've done everything correctly, it should work just like we had at the very beginning of the video. I type something in, click add, and now I need to do a hard refresh for it to show up. And that's just because I don't have my revalidate going on anywhere inside of here. So what I can do is I can just say revalidate path. There we go. That's actually going to properly revalidate my path. And now if I change this, hit add, you can see it's adding it in there. So let's again clear out our database. So we're left with just those 2 items. Now we're going to give that a hard refresh. You can see there we go. And now what I want to talk about is how this works with closures. So one thing you can actually do with these server actions is you can define them inside of a server component. So I can actually come in here and define this function directly inside of this server component, and it'll still work just fine. I type in new, and you can see that this gets added to my list. But what happens if I have a variable defined out here? We'll just say completed, and we'll set that equal to true. And then we also want to pass that along inside of here. So we'll say that we're completed is going to be passed along right here. Now you'll notice that this is actually going to set my completed value to true for this next one. So we'll call this one true complete. If I click add, you can see it adds this element. And if I go to my database, you can see this true complete has my completed marked as true. But how exactly is this working? Because as you remember, everything is working on the server. This is rendering on the server, this is rendering on the server, but obviously it needs to pass the information up from the client to the server because it's passing this, for example, up from the client to the server. So Next.js does some really interesting stuff to actually make this work. If we just inspect our page real quick and we go over to the network tab and I try to make a new request and I click add and we look at actually what's being passed up, you'll notice something really interesting. As you can see inside this payload, we have this number 1 with a bunch of random information, and then down here we have some more random information and our title that's being passed up normally. Essentially, what this is doing is it's taking this completed value, which I have set to true, and it's actually encrypting that information and sending it down to the client. And then when I make my server request by clicking this add button, it's taking that encrypted value, sending it back up to the server, and then using that information. So if you create a server action inside of a server component and then use a variable from outside of it inside of that server action, in normal JavaScript, this obviously makes sense. It would just work because of the way scoping and closures work. But since there's a client server boundary that's being passed, what Next.js has to do is it has to take all the variables that you use inside of this function and it has to pass them down to the client. But obviously, if you had something like a password or other really sensitive information, you don't want to have that information being passed down to the client by accident. This is why by default, Next.js is going to encrypt every single thing that gets sent down to the client based on this type of closure activity. And then when it gets sent back up to the server when you make your request, it's then going to decrypt that information so it can use it inside of your code. I know this sounds rather complicated, but essentially this is just a fancy way for me saying that if you use scoping and closures and you use a variable outside your server action inside your server action without passing it in through the props, Next.js is going to send that value down to the client and then send it back up to the server, and it's going to encrypt it in between, just in case some of that data that's being passed down happens to be sensitive data. Also, this is only something you have to worry about in server components because, for example, in this case where we had our server action being passed into our client component, well, it doesn't matter what we're doing here because this action right here, this code actually runs on the client and not on the server. As you can see, if I put a console log that says here, and I just make sure that I use this to-do form inside of our page. So here, I'll replace the form with our to-do form, just like that. And we'll make sure that everything looks like it should be working. So if I come in here, type something in, click add, and then I inspect my console, we'll see that inside of here, it's printing out here for my console. And that's again, because this action runs on the client, but the actual server action, the thing that we're calling off to, this is what runs on the server. All this other code runs on the client. That's why we're able to access this input ref inside of here, for example. So here, closures don't really matter as much. Now, the final thing I want to talk about with binding data is if we go back to our database here, we'll just clear all this out so we have a fresh slate to start with. But we'll go to our page itself. I'll bring this back to when we had the actual form being called right here with our create to do. That's perfect. Let's clean that up a little bit. And I want to change this create to do so it actually takes another property. Let's say that it takes in a completed property, which is a Boolean, and then it also takes our form data after that, just for some particular reason, and we'll remove this completed up here as well. We can even just take this and we can move it back out of our actual server component so it's a little bit easier to read. Now you'll notice that this doesn't work because I need to pass along the data that is inside of here for the completed field, and this is just passing along my form data. So you may think, well, what I can do is I can just make this an arrow function, form data, and I'll call this with true for completed, and I'll pass along my form data, give that a quick save, and boom, all of a sudden it no longer works. And that's because since we're inside of a server component, we can't pass along a function like this to action. It can't be a custom function. It must only be a server action. So we can only pass along a server action. So something like this would be okay. But obviously this doesn't work because we don't have our properties being set up properly because we have this extra completed property. This is where the bind keyword comes in. This is a JavaScript feature that you're probably familiar with. What you can do is you can say .bind, pass in null as the this object, that's just what you're going to pass along. And then for the second object, we pass along whatever we want the first property to be. So in our case, let's say we want completed to be true. Now, if I give that a save, you can see all my errors are gone. I get no errors over here. And if I type in new, click add, you can see it adds that element. And inside of my database, the completed has been marked as true. Now, if we look at behind the scenes to see what's happening inside of Next.js, let's just say new to, we'll inspect our page, and then we'll click the add button on this to take a look at the network request. I accidentally added it twice, but here we go. If we look at this, you'll notice here that it's passing along extra props. So we have this true prop being passed along. Same thing here, our true property is being passed along. So it's just essentially saying, hey, pass along true as well as all the different form data that's being passed in. So this is specifically only in the use cases where you have a server action that requires more information than just your form data, and you can't pass along a custom function since you're inside of a server component, and you can only use custom functions inside of a client component. So this is essentially the only use case where you would need to use this binding syntax. This is fairly niche, but it's something that you should be aware of. And Next.js does a little bit more behind the scenes than just your normal JavaScript bind, again, to make sure that this works between the server and the client interaction. Now, if you're a bit overwhelmed with all this information that we've covered in this video, that's perfectly okay. This is a lot to take in, especially with so limited examples. And really, you're just going to need to spend some time with it and look at some more examples, which is great because in the next few videos, we're going to be covering more topics related to server actions, which is going to give you a lot more exposure to them before we finally dive into a project where we implement server actions so you can really see how they work in a more real world project. Now I have slightly modified our code from the last video to simplify it a little bit. As you can see, we have our create to do action. That's essentially exactly the same. It's just taking in our form data and it allows us to create a brand new to do. Same thing on our form, that hasn't changed at all. The big difference is that now my to-dos, I'm printing out a new component, a to-do item here, and this to-do item has an input, which is a checkbox, as well as the title. So you can see I can change my checkbox. But the one thing to note is that these changes do not save when I refresh my page. For example, as you can see, laundry always stays checked, and this always stays unchecked no matter what I do to my page. So I want to essentially make it so that I can persist these changes, and this is again something I can use server actions for. But I don't need a full form for this. Essentially, every time my input changes, I want to fire off a server action that updates my to-do. So what I've done is I've created a server action already for this. You can see this toggle to do takes in an ID and a completed field, and all it's doing is it's just calling the put method to update the to do and passing along the completed field that it wants to update, and then revalidating this path so those changes will actually show up. Now we talked about in the last video how you can use server actions with forms, but you can actually use server actions outside of forms as well. And this is a perfect use case for that because essentially I just want to have an on-change event listener that calls that server action for me. So to use an on-change event listener, we need to make this a client. So we're going to say use client at the top here. So this is a client component. And for our on-change, I essentially just want to call that server action for me inside of here. So let's create an asynchronous function. There we go. This is going to take in my event. And we can get the target inside of here. So I want to call that server action, which I called toggle to do. So we'll say toggle to do. This is going to be taking in my ID, which is the parameter that I'm passing in here, as well as the e.target.checked. There we go. This is going to be a Boolean on whether or not this checkbox is checked. And then we could just await the response from this because this is going to be some asynchronous code that's going to happen. So now if I give that a quick save and I toggle my checkbox and I refresh my page, you're noticing that that change is being persisted. Now you will notice it actually deleted the title from my to-do, and that's just because here this should say patch instead of put. There we go, that should fix it. So now if I checkbox this one, you can see it doesn't actually remove the title. So inside of my database, I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna add that title and user information back in there. So we'll say user ID, and the title for this one was laundry. So we'll come in here, laundry, there we go. Now if I give that a quick save and do a hard refresh, we can see my information is there. And again, the nice thing is this is refreshing on my page and it's persisting all across. So if I go over to my to-do item, or I'm sorry, my to-do method here, and I just console log inside of here, and I just say hi, if I inspect on my client, you'll notice I don't get anything being printed out. Look inside the console, and no matter what I do, checking, unchecking, it's never being printed out. But if I check in my server log, you can see every time I check and uncheck, it's logging this in the server, because essentially what's happening behind the scenes is I'm making a network request every single time that I toggle my to-do and passing along the ID and then the property of true versus false. So this is the simplest use case of using a server action not inside of a form. And as long as you just use it on some type of event listener and you make sure you await the call, it's going to work just fine. Now what happens if we wanted to do something a little bit more complicated though? Let's come in here and we'll create a brand new component and it's going to be a select all button. So we'll say select all button, export the function, select all button. And this is just going to be a button that when we click on it, it's going to toggle all of our to-dos to be true. So what we can do is we can just return a button that just says select all. Let's make this a client component. There we go, select all, just like that. We're gonna come down into our page. We're gonna put that button inside of there. Let's just put it at the top here. Select all button, there we go. So now you can see we have this button, and right now clicking it does nothing. But if we were to set up an on-click event listener, and we made sure we called a select all function, which we can just create in a second. We'll just come up here, export the function that's going to say toggle to do. First, we need to get our to-dos, and then we need to update each one individually. So actually what I'm gonna do instead, to make it a little bit easier, is I'll just call this toggle to do function multiple times with every single ID that we have. Obviously that's not super optimal for like a real world application performance wise, calling all these over and over. It'd be better to make one request, but for our particular case, it's gonna be fine. So let's just take in all the different IDs, which is going to be a number array, just like that. And on click, all I want to do is use this as an async function. And I just want to call something for each one of these individual IDs. So we'll say IDs.map, and for each ID, I want to call that it's toggle to do function, and I want to toggle the ID to be true, just like that. I can return this value, and then I can put this inside of a promise.all, so we can essentially just await for all of these different things to happen before we do anything else, just like that. So this is going to wait for all those promises to resolve. So now if I give that a quick save and I select all, you'll notice nothing quite happens and we have an error showing up. This is because I need to make sure I actually pass along all the different IDs, which is just todos.map, and I want to get each individual ID. So todo.id, there we go. So let's just do a hard refresh on our page, and I click select all, and you'll notice nothing actually happens, but when I refresh my page, you'll see that they are already checked. So we need to make sure that our information propagates properly into these checked fields. So the best way for us to do that is to change default checked here to checked, and that should fix the problem. So now if I uncheck these, and I just do a hard refresh, it's all working fine, click select all, and you can see it has checked those checkboxes. But what happens if for some reason this function is actually kind of slow? Let's just come in here and we're going to throw in a wait for 2 seconds. And let's just create this wait function. What's the duration? Which is a number. And we're going to return a new promise, which is just going to resolve a set timeout for that duration. There we go. So we're just going to wait 2 seconds for each one of these requests. So let's uncheck everything. And you'll actually notice immediately we see a problem, and that is the checking and unchecking process is incredibly slow. When I click this, you notice there's a 2-second wait before the checkbox actually shows up as checked. And that's because this checked property comes from our API. So if we come over to our toggle to do, this is causing our API to actually change that data. It then needs to get refetched from our API, and then it actually gets passed down into here to change this checked property. So this is obviously not ideal. So instead we should have some type of loading state to show to the user to show them that something is happening, which is why generally if you're using a server action somewhere that is not inside of a function, you want to wrap it inside of a use transition. So we can use the use transition hook just like this. And this gives us essentially an is pending state and a start transition function that it returns from here. And we can just call start transition and we can pass it in the code that we want to essentially have that pending state for. Make sure that this is asynchronous so it knows to wait for that code. And now we have this is pending and we can do whatever we want with that. For example, I'm just going to disable my checkbox. So we'll say disabled if we are currently in the pending state. So now when I click on this, you can see my checkbox is disabled until that pending state goes away and then it unchecks itself. You could do other things inside of here like show a loading spinner or so on, but this is essentially the thing that I want to do for this select all button, because when I click on this, it takes a very long time for this information to update because it has to make 2 separate calls and each one takes 2 seconds. So inside of here, I want to do that exact same thing. I'm going to get that use transition hook, make sure I import that into here, and then I can just disable the button in the pending state. So is pending, it's disabled, and then we can even change the text. So if it's pending, we can say that the text is going to say loading. Otherwise, it's going to say select all. So now if we close that off, make sure we wrap this in a start transition. And we make sure that we make this one async. Everything should be working just fine. So let's uncheck both of these. You can see we get that nice loading state, which is really great. Everything is super responsive, but obviously the loading state is helping us show that something's happening. Now when I clicked select all, you can see it says loading. It'll say that for 4 seconds, and then it'll check these checkboxes and go back to normal. So this is the main way you're going to be using server actions besides actually inside a form. But there's actually a third way you can use server actions, which is much more limited and probably something you shouldn't really use in my opinion, but it is using them inside of a use effect. So if you really want to, inside of your code, you can set up a use effect. And inside this use effect, you can actually call a server action every single time that this use effect runs. So let's say that we want this to run only on mount. Well, what I could do is I could toggle it to do. So I can say toggle to do. I'm going to toggle the first to do, and I'm going to set it to true. So now every single time I mount my component, the first to do is going to be toggled to true. So let's come in here. We'll uncheck this for now. You can see that it's unchecking that, and then it's going to be there we go. So let's refresh our page. You can see we refreshed our page. It is toggling this to do, and after 1 second, it should actually show up as true. There you go. After those 2 seconds passed, you can see that this showed up as true. Now, the reason I don't recommend using these server actions inside of use effects is because almost every single time you have a server action, it is because it's a side effect of some type of user interaction, such as clicking a button, clicking a checkbox, submitting a form, and almost never do you want a server action to happen just based on like page navigation. Now, if you're doing like analytics, for example, obviously it makes sense to put that in a use effect. Every time you change your page, you may want to log that you've changed your page. That's a great case for a server action inside of a use effect. But other than those really niche use cases, this is really something that I would recommend you not do, just because it's much harder to maintain your code like this versus if you just do it inside of event listeners. But obviously in those specific cases, you may need to do that, which is why it's here. Now in the next video, I'm actually going to talk about how we can clean this code up to make it even more responsive, even if your backend is incredibly slow. Now I've cleaned up the code slightly from the last video. I just removed that select all button, but we still have the problem with the 2-second delay every single time we click on our button. And we essentially want to fake this delay by showing the user what they want to see before the server actually responds with the correct information. And this is called optimistic updates. Essentially what happens is I know that when I click on this checkbox that the checkbox should go from true to false. So I want to automatically show it as false and then wait for my server response to come back to actually verify that that should be changed to false. And if so, just keep it as is. And if for some reason it should have stayed as true because my server action failed, then it would revert back to true. So to do that, I can actually use a hook that's built into React, but works really well with Next.js, and that is the use optimistic hook. And you can see we're importing that directly from React. And this use optimistic hook works very similar to use state, and that's because it actually returns to us the same things use state would. For example, we get our state and our set state function being returned here, and what we pass to use optimistic is essentially the source of truth for all of our information. So in our case, it is an ID, title, and completed. I'm just going to pass that in, and that's actually going to come in as a to-do. So here, I'm just going to say that this is our to-do, just like that. And I'm going to pass in my to-do here. And now down here, I'm going to say to-do.completed. Here is going to be to-do.id, and then to-do.title, just to make it a little bit easier. So here we have our optimistic to-do, and then here we have our set optimistic to-do, just like that. So essentially what I want to do is I want to replace everywhere I have a to-do with my optimistic to-do. So I'm just going to replace these sections with my optimistic to-do. This one I'll keep as my normal to-do though, because this is not something that's actually being updated. The only thing really being updated is this completed property here. So if I wanted, I could technically just store the completed property in here, which actually might be best. So in our case, we'll just store completed. So we'll say optimistic completed and set optimistic completed. There we go. I can change this back to ID title completed, just like that. And then down here, we can pass along our ID. This is going to be our optimistic completed value, and then this is going to be our title. So essentially all we're doing is we're saying that we want to optimistically update our completed property. Now, anytime we call set optimistic completed, that's going to update this value right here to the newest value. So here I can say that I want to update this to e.target.checked. There we go. So now immediately you'll notice something interesting. When I click on laundry, it immediately checks the checkbox and then it waits 2 seconds before it undisables this to essentially say that this has completely finished everything that I want to do. So the way this is actually working step by step is when I first click my checkbox, what's happening is it's calling set optimistic completed, which is changing this optimistic completed to whatever that value is, false or true. And then it's re-rendering my component with that checked value being set. So it's immediately giving me what I think the actual result would be. Then in the background, this toggle to do is running, it's running, and it finally finishes running, which re-renders this component. It passes down a new completed property, which gets passed into use optimistic here, which then causes my optimistic completed to be updated with that new value that just came back from the server. So this means that even if my server value is different from my optimistic update, it'll still change back to that server value. So let's say, for example, inside of here, instead of actually setting it to the completed Boolean, we just always set this property to true. So now, no matter what I do, when I click on my checkbox, it'll always come back with a completed of true. So when I go from false to true, everything works just fine. But now let's see what happens when I go from true to false. I click on this, you can see my checkbox is unchecked, and then immediately reverts back to checked. And that's because the data I'm getting from here is saying that my completed property is true. I think optimistically that the value will be false, but my actual server returns a different value to me, and this use optimistic hook makes sure to update that value as soon as it changes from the server. So when my server sends down new information, this hook says, okay, we got the new information from the server, update what I thought the value would be with what the value actually is. The really great thing with this is we can actually even remove this start transition. We now no longer really care about this because we're optimistically updating everything. So if I change this to be asynchronous like that, give this a quick save, you notice I can check mark this all I want to, and it's going to just do everything else behind the scenes to give me the most up-to-date value of what this actually should be. So it looks like everything is working incredibly smoothly on the front end for me, but behind the scenes, it's making sure everything is going to be working. And now you can see after a while, it actually changed my checkbox back to true. And that's because every time I call this, my completed property is being manually set to true. So on the front end, it can look like everything is working optimistically, but if for some reason it's different than what I think it'll be, it'll make sure it'll eventually correct itself once the API finishes resolving. The reason it takes so long for us is because we have this artificial 2-second delay in here. If we didn't have that, it would be much quicker to actually do these changes for us. Now in this video, I want to talk a bit more about some hooks that you can use specifically when you're working with server actions inside of forms. So for this very first hook that I want to talk about, I've changed our code slightly by adding a 2-second wait into our create to do right here. So that way, anytime we try to create a to do, click add, you're going to notice there's a 2-second delay, but there's no feedback on my end that this is actually working. So what I want to do is show the user feedback to show them this is currently pending and waiting for my API response. This is where the hook called use form status comes in. It essentially gives me all the information I want about my currently running form. And to use this hook, I must use it inside of a component that is inside my form that is currently running, which means that I must create a brand new custom component that is inside this form. And in our case, I want to use it specifically on the button. So I'm going to create my own submit button component. And this must be a client component. So let's create that inside of here. We'll say submit button.tsx, and up here export function submit button, and I just want to return this button just like that. So if I just make sure I import this, everything is working as exactly as it did before, but now I can use that use form status hook in here. So use form status just like that. This is actually a hook directly from React. It works really well with Next.js though, and what I'm getting back from this is a bunch of information inside of an object. So you can see here I have my action that is being performed, I have the data that's being passed along to it, the method, as well as the thing we really care about, the pending. This is going to be true if my form is currently in the process of submitting. So I can just come in here, disable my button when it is pending, and then I can change my text as well. So I can say that my text is going to be adding, or it's just going to say add like that. And if I make sure I close this off, give that a quick save, refresh my page, and make sure I mark this as a client component because we're using a custom hook inside of here, this use form status hook. Now, if I type something in and click add, you're going to notice my button is disabled. It changes my text. And then after those 2 seconds elapses, the content shows up down here, which is exactly what I wanted. Now, just to recap how this hook works is you have to guarantee that the component that you're using this hook is inside of your form. So as you can see, this component is inside my form, which is why it works. I could not use this out here. If I wanted to say use form status, this does not work because this is outside of my form. As you can see, my form is in here and this is outside of that form. So it must be in a component that's inside of your form. As long as you have that working, everything else is pretty self-explanatory. And really for most cases, all you really care about is that pending state. And the next hook that I want to talk about is the use form state hook. And this one is actually built into Next.js and it's how you deal with errors inside of server actions. So I want to kind of show you the reason why this would be important. Let's say that I actually try to create a to-do with no title. I click add, it's actually going to allow me to create this to-do. You can see it shows up down here with absolutely no title at all. And you can see inside my database, again, it has absolutely no title. Let's just clean up the database so we're back to just having 2 items inside of it. Give that a refresh, there we go. But what I want to do inside of here is just do a simple check to see if there is something wrong with my thing. So what I can do is I can get my title, which is just form data.get title, just like that, and that is going to be as a string. There we go. So I can pass along my title into here. And what I want to do is just do a simple check to see if my title is equal to an empty string. Well, if so, I obviously have some type of problem going on. So I want to return just some error. We'll just say error message, no title was given. There we go. So now if I go ahead and I try to add something with a title, you can see it's going to be working just fine. That shows up. And if I try to add something with no title, you can see I click add, it waits 2 seconds, and then all of a sudden you can see it doesn't add anything at all because we never called this fetch function or revalidated our path. Instead, we're returning this error message. But how exactly do we access that error message? You may think we just come down here where we're actually calling this create to do and get it from here, but actually instead you use a use form state hook. So this use form state hook is actually going to return to us all the information that we need. So if we do a const here, set that equal to our use form state hook, this is going to return to us two separate things. The first is going to be the state, or essentially whatever we return from this function up here. So in my case, this is going to be my error object. We'll just call this error. The second thing it's going to return to us is the action that we can actually call. And that's because with use form state, you actually pass it in the action that you want to do this with. So in our case, I want to do this with our create to do action, which is what we have right up here. And then you pass it in some initial default state. So by default, my initial state is just going to be an empty object with an error message that's set to an empty string. That's fine. Now you will notice we are getting some errors though, and that's because whenever you use the use form state hook with a action, this action actually needs to take in two parameters. It's going to take in your form data, and then before that, it takes in whatever your previous state is. And in our case, we don't really care about this previous state. I'll just type it as unknown, but we don't really care what the previous state is. That previous state is essentially just our last error message that we returned from this function. So now what we can do is replace this create to do with our actual action. You can see this works just fine. And then we can just come in here and we can console.log out the error that we're getting, which is our error message. And we can also come in here and actually print that out if we really want to. So for example, I can create a div that just says error.error message, just like that. And now if we have an error message, it's going to show up right there. Now, one problem we're obviously getting though, is that we're using this, which is a client hook inside of a server function, a server component. So we need to move all of this code into its own component. So we'll say to do form.tsx, just like that. And inside of here, I'm just going to take this entire form, move it into that component. So export function to do form. And this is just so I can use all that client related code. There we go. We can import our submit button from here. Then what we can do is we can go back into our page, replace this with our to-do form. And then we need to make sure we obviously take this custom hook, which is the important thing, out of here, and we put it into our to-do form. Let's make sure that we import this just like that, and create to-do. I'm just going to pass it down. It doesn't really matter how this gets in here. We can just pass it down, and I'll just type this as any, so we don't have to worry about any of our typing related stuff for now. So also let's get the error message and make sure we put that inside of here as well. So let's come in here and paste down that error message. There we go. So now what we can do is pass in that create to do from our page. So here, create to do is our create to do, just like that. We now no longer have any errors. And if I make sure that I mark this as a client component, everything should be working. There we go. You can see really all I've done is I've just taken our code, moved it to a client component, and you can see we now have this use form state. So let's go ahead and we'll add something just like normal. Click add. After 2 seconds, that'll show up right down here, which is great. Now let's remove the title and see what happens. I click add. After a 2-second delay, you'll now see that we get this error message being sent back to us and nothing gets added at all. So essentially, the important thing to understand about this use form state is you pass it in the server action that you want to do this with. In our case, create to do, and you pass it in whatever your default state is. It doesn't matter. We could even just leave this completely blank if we wanted to, so we can have a completely blank state. The problem is obviously some TypeScript errors, which is why I put in this default error message inside of here. That's just an empty string. Then it returns to you whatever that state that you're going to be getting back in, as well as a new action that you can pass to a form. And the important thing to understand about all this is that whenever you use an action inside of a form state, it must take in this previous state as its very first parameter. So if we just do a quick console.log of previous state, we can actually see what this returns to us inside of here. So let's say that we want to type something in, click add. You can see after a 2-second delay, it's going to log that out, and you can see it logged out our error message because that was the last state that we had. Now let's say we add something else. There we go, click add, and you can see again, it's going to show us what the previous state is. And in our case, it's undefined because we didn't have any errors the last time and we just let our application return as normal. Now you can return other things than error messages. I could return down here like true if it was successful, and that'll show up as my previous state anytime that happens. So let's create something brand new. I click add, we come down here and you can see it'll say undefined, but if I create something else, the previous state was true. So you can see now down here, it's going to be set as true. So that is something else that you can do. You don't have to just return error messages, but most of the time when you're returning things from a server action, it's probably going to be an error message. And again, just to really quickly recap exactly what's going on, You take your use form state, you pass it in your action that makes sure it has that special extra prop being added in at the top of it. And then that's going to give you whatever you return from your action, as well as the new action you can pass into the action prop for your form. So this extra hook is essentially the way that you get around not being able to directly access the return value of the action, because obviously if you did like a normal use effect that had a fetch inside of it, you would have access to the .then property of the fetch, which gives you that return value. This is essentially getting around that by allowing you to do that inside of this server action model. But again, you don't generally have to do this except for handling error messages, and that's because all of the additional things like revalidating your paths automatically update your data for you. Up to this point, we've talked a lot about server actions, so it's finally time to actually start implementing server actions in our own project. So for this project, I have the starting code on the left-hand side, and I have right here an open version of the starting code for this project, and it's going to be very similar to the starting code from the previous project. There's just a few minor changes that I've made. The first minor change I've made is inside the source folder. If I go to DB and I go to the post folder, you'll notice inside of here that there's a couple new functions. I have a create post function, which takes a title, a body, and a user ID, and it creates us a brand new post. Update post is very similar, but it takes in a post ID as well as all the things that you want to update, and it'll update that. And then finally, delete post takes in an ID, and it'll delete that ID from the database. So I've just added these functions in so you don't have to actually interact with the database at all, so it doesn't matter if you know Prisma or not. The next thing is inside of the actual post page itself. So if I go into our app, our post, and I go to that particular page, you'll notice inside of here that I've just added this top section. I've added a button to go to the new post. And if you see over here and I click on that, it brings me to that new post page. And speaking of the new post page, that is another thing that I added inside of here, this number 4 step right here. So if I go into that new folder and I go to this page, you can see inside of here it's just an H1 followed by our post form, which is the final new thing that I've added. So if we open up that post form, which is just in our components folder, you can see it has our post form at the top and then a skeleton version at the bottom for any type of loading state that you want to do. So I just have both of these inside of here. The final thing that I changed is you'll notice this user select options. I actually moved that out into its own brand new file, and that's just because I want to make it so that we can use this inside of multiple places. You'll also notice I add this one single prop into this just so we can have an any option on our actual page here. So if we go to our post, you can see this has an any option, while on the new page, we don't have that any option. So that's what I've done inside of here for all the new different changes. So overall, it's pretty minor stuff. I just added essentially this shell of the HTML and CSS you're going to need to get this to work. Now, again, the main goal of this project is going to be working on server actions and everything related to them, such as loading states, revalidation, and so on. For the database, you don't have to touch anything in the database. You'll use the code from there, but you don't have to actually interact with the database directly. Just use the functions I've already created. Then finally, we come on to the instructions on what to do. The first thing I want you to do is to make it so that the new post page functions properly. Right now, you can see that everything is just hard-coded. Nothing works, so I click save. It doesn't actually do anything. This form doesn't submit properly. So the first thing you want to do is actually make it so that this page works. Then when you do that, I want to also make sure that all the caches are properly revalidated. Then what I want you to do is to create an edit post page and make it functional using server actions. Exact same thing. Make sure all the caches are revalidated. And if I look at the final version of the project, you'll notice on any post page, there should be an edit button in the top right-hand corner here. Then same exact thing with a delete button, add that to the same exact page, and then it's going to delete the post, redirect to the post page, and then ensure all the caches are properly revalidated. So if I click delete here, you can see it just redirects me back to this main post page once it deletes that post. Now, if I continue onward, you'll see here in the bonuses, I want you to add a loading state for the new and edit pages and the delete button. And this should be both a loading state to load the pages as well as for the forms and so on. So for example, if I click on new and I try to type something in here and I click save, you notice I get a loading state on the button itself. And now it's created a brand new post with all of that information. You can see that when I click edit, it's going to bring me to this page. And it's the very first time this page is loading. You'll notice I actually get this loading state when my cache doesn't have information inside of it. Same thing here with the save button. That also gives me a loading state. And finally, if I come over and I click on a particular post and I click on the delete button, you'll notice that I get a loading state for that as well. So it just gives me information about what's happening with my page. Now, the last thing to worry about is just to add in data validation. Essentially, just make it so that the title, user ID, and body are required. And if they're not properly filled in, throw an error. And this validation should be done both on the client as well as in the server action. So if we come over to the final version here, and I were to just go ahead and I click new and I click save, you'll notice it's saying that this is required. Now, this currently doesn't have the client-side validation because it's impossible for me to be able to demonstrate both of them working simultaneously, but just make sure that you include both of them in the final version. The client-side validation is essentially just adding the required property to all the different HTML fields. And then you also want to do that check in the server side on the server action, just to make sure no data gets through your client that's bad data. Now, for the most part, it's not too much that you need to do. It's really focusing on that new, edit, and delete button, and then just making sure all the other things like loading states and validation work around that. That's what the bonus section is entirely about. Now, to get started with this project, the very first thing that we're going to be focusing on is this new post page. And inside of here, we have our post form. Now, you may think that since we're doing server actions and everything, we can just come into our post form, which is currently a server component, and we can just create our action directly inside of here. But the problem is this post form component, I'm most likely going to want to share the exact same component between my new and my edit page, but they're going to have completely different actions that I want to resolve. Now, I could do all that inside of here with like an if check, or I could just pass the action in. Either way is going to work. But for now, to get started, I'm just going to come into here and I'm going to create the action that allows me to create a brand new post. So I'm just going to say function create new post, just like that. I'm going to put use server at the top of this, so I know that this is a server action. And inside of here, I essentially just want to call the create post function. So that create post function is coming directly from that database folder file right here. And inside of here, this is going to be passing in a title. It's going to be passing in a body, as well as passing in the user ID that I want to create. And of course, we're going to await this and just actually return this value right here. And then we can just say that this is going to be an async function just like that. So we need to figure out what the title, the body, and the user ID are going to be. And we can, of course, get that from our form data because we know that we get form data passed in whenever we use an action. So what I can do is I can take this action and I can actually pass this down, which is create new post. Then inside of my post form, I can take in that action and I can use that for my form action. So here I can pass in the action just like that, which I called action. Now for now, I'm just going to type this as any. We'll come back and fix the typing. That's just going to hopefully clean up some of my TypeScript related errors. And now to get the title, body, and user ID, I can just get those from my form data. So I can say const title equals form data.get title. And I want to cast that to a string, just like that. Now I'm going to just take this down, do the same exact thing for my body. And this one is also going to be a string. And then finally here I have my user ID, and this one is going to be a number. So I'm going to take this and convert it to a number, user ID, just like that. Now the reason I can use title, body, and user ID is because inside of my form, you'll see that my input here has the name of title. This one has the name of user ID, and then down here we have the name of body. So this actually should hook everything up for me. So what I can do is just take this error message. For now, I'm just going to remove this, but you'll know that we can pass error messages along this way. But now if I click new, you'll see I have everything cleared out. And if I just type in test, and for my body, I type in test and I hit save, you'll notice after a little bit of a delay, it should hopefully create that post for me, but it looks like maybe something is going wrong. If we go ahead and we look at our code, I think the reason nothing is actually happening is because we're not doing any redirecting or anything right here. What I would want to do is actually redirect. So what I can do here is just get my post just like this. That's the brand new post that I've created. And I can actually use the redirect function, which I make sure comes from next/navigation. There we go. And I want to redirect to /post/ and I want to get my post.id. So this is going to be the ID of the brand new post I just created. So now if I actually click save, this should create a brand new post and redirect me to that post page. And as you can see, it has done exactly that. And if I go to my overall post and I search for test, we should see 2 total results. The first result from when I clicked save and didn't have this redirect code, and the second one from when I clicked save and it did have the redirect code. Now this is working great, except for there's one problem, and that's that we're not properly revalidating our old pages that already exist. For example, let's say I create a brand new one, and I'll call this test new, and we'll just put some stuff in the body, and I'll click on save. Now what's going to happen when I go back to my overall post here and I click test as my search and I search, you'll notice it doesn't show up. And that's because I've already made this search before, so it's in my cache, and I never actually cleared the cache for this particular search, which means it's no longer finding the new values from the new post I just created. If I do a hard refresh on my page, you'll now notice that it will show up because it cleared my cache, but before it wasn't showing up. So I need to come in here and revalidate my cache. I'm going to do that on a path basis. So I'm going to revalidate my post page, and I'm also going to revalidate the page for my particular user as well. So I'll say user.id, and this is going to be the users page. Now the reason I'm also doing the user page, and I believe this is actually user ID just like that. There we go. Now the reason I'm also doing this user page is because if I go onto the users and I, for example, view this particular user, I want to see all the brand new posts that I've created for that user, and I want to make sure it refreshes properly. So you can see here that that post is properly showing up, and that's only if I do this revalidate properly. So just to test that this is all working, let's create a brand new post. I'm just going to call it whatever I want. It doesn't really matter. It's going to be going to that brand new first user. I'm going to click save, and then we're going to go to that user's page, and we should see that now it's doing a full load of this page because I completely revalidated this path. And at the very bottom, we have that brand new post we just created. So now the next step, if we actually just look at our README real quick, is going to be moving on to the edit post page, which is going to be very similar to the new post page, but obviously this is going to be for editing a post instead of doing a brand new post. So for example, let's just view this post right here. I want to add in the edit button for that post. So what we can do is we can go to get that edit button. We can just copy this entire thing because I want this to essentially be what I'm using on my post page. So I can go to the page for my post here. And up here where I have my H1, you can see it's in 2 separate parts. We have an H1 here and we have an H1 in our post details. I'm going to paste down this first H1 here. And I just want to get the div section inside of that. So there we go. I'm just adding essentially an edit button inside of here. And this is going to go to post / I want to get my ID / edit. There we go. Make sure I get all these parentheses closed off properly. There we go. And this right here is actually post ID. There we go. So now I can just copy this. I can go down into my post details and exactly the same thing. Here's my H1. I'm just going to put it directly below that. So I have a link that's going to that edit page. So now you can see I have that edit link right here. And when I click on it, it's going to bring me to that edit page. I just need to make sure I put a / in front of my URLs. So that way they're going to be absolute instead of relative. There we go. So now if I go back, I refresh this page and I click on my link, you can see it's bringing me to the edit page. So now if I create a new folder called edit, and inside of here, I create a brand new page. I'll just copy it directly from my new post. And this one is going to be edit existing post. There we go. Here is going to be my edit post page. It's going to say edit post just like that. And it's going to take in my edit existing post action. And this edit action is just going to be calling update post. And it's going to be making sure that it takes in the actual ID of the post that I'm updating as well. So this should take in my post ID as a number. And then I can pass in that post ID just like that. And technically this post ID is actually going to be a string because I'm going to be getting that from the params. So here I can get my params, and the params are just post ID. And then I can go ahead and I can actually type those params. So I have my params post ID, which is a string. There we go. And now I can take that post ID and essentially pass it into my edit existing post. And the best way for me to do that is using bind. So I can just come down here. I can bind my first parameter by saying null and then whatever that parameter is, which in my case is post ID. So now I'm essentially taking an action. I'm binding this first property to post ID and creating a brand new function that only takes in the form data, which is exactly what we want. So now that is at least getting the edit section to work. So if I just type in a new title and I type in a new body and I click save, it's actually going to edit that information. We're not doing any revalidation, but if I manually refresh this page, you should see that it's actually edited that information, as you can see, just like that. So let me just add in the additional revalidation to revalidate this post. So we can come in here. I want to revalidate the post route, and I want to revalidate it for my particular post ID. And down here, I'll just change this to post ID like that. Another thing I could do is also just say post ID to actually get the ID from the brand new post. Same thing with my user ID. I could say post.userid just to make sure it's going to be the most up-to-date information. I'll do that on my new page as well. So here I'll say post.userid just to make sure no matter what, it's always getting the information from the database and not whatever's being passed in from my form. Honestly, it shouldn't matter because they should be the same, but just in case. So now we actually have our edit page done. If I click edit, type in a new title for this and a new body and click save, you'll see that that new information is actually propagated properly, which is what we want. But obviously when I click edit, I want to pre-populate the title, body, and the author to be the correct information. This isn't actually too tricky though. All I need to do is get my post here. So I can say const post equals get post, just like that. Make sure that I import this get post function. There we go. And I need to pass it in my post ID, just like that. I'll await this and I'll make this an async function. Then we can just pass that down to our post form. So I'll say my post is equal to post. Now in our form, I'm going to come in here and actually do some typing. So we'll just call this our props. And then we'll come up here and give that a type. Type of props is equal to, we're going to have an action prop, and that is essentially just a function. That function takes in form data. So we'll say form data, which is of the type form data, and it's going to return to us a promise. And that promise right now will return nothing. So we'll just say a promise that returns a void. Then what we want to do is we want to take in our post. This is going to be an optional thing, and this is just going to have a title, and that title is a string. It's going to have a body, which is going to be a string, and a user ID, which is going to be a string just like that. So now I can get inside of here and actually get my post. There we go. And it'll also have an ID. And this was going to be a number. There we go. So now I optionally can pass in a post, or I can pass in just my action. So if I come into here, it looks like I do have an error with my post. The reason for this error is because actually, technically, my user ID is a number. So I can change this to number, and that'll clean up all those errors. If I come back into here, that error should be gone. It looks like that's not the full error though. Actually, the reason I'm getting errors is because post could technically be null. So if my post is equal to null, well then what I want to do is return not found, because obviously I can't edit a page that I can't actually find. So now if I just do a hard refresh on this page, you'll notice it's working, but still it's not populating my fields. And that's because I need to come into my post form and set the default values. So here I can say that my default value is going to be that post.title. And that's only going to happen if I actually have a title. So now you can see that that title has been pre-populated. I'm going to do the exact same thing with my select, but this one is going to be my user ID. And then finally down here for my body, I'm going to do the exact same thing, but it's going to be for my body. So now you can see that this information is pre-populated. If I change the title to edit and I click save, you can see everything else has stayed exactly the same as it was before. And if I click on edit, you can see it's pre-populated that information. But if I go to, for example, create a brand new post, you can see every single one of these fields is blank, which is exactly what I want. Now, one thing I do want to do is make it so that my cancel button goes to the correct location. If I click cancel on new, it should take me back to this page. But if I'm on a particular post and I'm editing that post and I click cancel, it should take me back to that post. So here I just need to manually change this href based on if I'm modifying a post or not. So if I have a post, then what I want to do is I want to go to that particular post page. So /post/post ID, there we go. Otherwise, I just want to go to /post. There we go. So now if I'm just here on the new page, I click cancel, it brings me back to here. But if I'm editing an individual post and I click cancel, it should have brought me back to that post. I believe it may have been doing with caching. So I'm going to go to this edit page, do a hard refresh just to get rid of anything that has to do with caching. And now I'm going to click cancel, and you can see it has properly brought me back to that location. Now that covers everything we need to do for editing, so we can finally move on to the delete button, which is going to be quite a bit different because this is a button instead of a form. So what we can do is we can go back to our view post page right here where we have our edit button. And I also want to add in a delete button, but this must be a client component since we want to do something on click and it's not going to be a form. So I'm going to create a component just called delete button, just like that. And I'll create a brand new file called delete button.tsx. There we go. And in here, export a function called delete button. And all this delete button is going to do is it's going to take in the post ID that we want to delete. So we can say here, post ID, that's going to be a string. And all it's going to do is just delete that thing. So we can create a button, and that button is just going to say delete inside of it. And then on click, all we want to do is delete that post. So what we can do is just run a function, and inside this function, we can call delete post, just like that. We can make sure that this is being awaited, and we pass it in the post ID that we want to delete. And let's just make this async so that we can actually do that awaiting. There we go. Now, if I just make sure I properly import this delete button component and I use it in all the places that it needs to be used, and also make sure I pass along the post ID, there we go. And then I can take this and I can bring it down into my post details as well. So in the post details, I'm going to make sure I also include that delete button. There we go. And now we just need to make sure the delete button is actually a client component. So we can use that event listener. So we'll say use client up here, and that gets rid of all of our different errors. Now to properly style this, we should probably add some classes. So I'll just come in here with a class name of button, button outline, and button danger, and that's going to give us what we want. So now if I click delete, that should hopefully delete this post for us. So if I click on delete, we're immediately getting an error. If we look at that error, you'll notice it says Prisma client is unable to run in the browser. Essentially, it's trying to run this on-click code inside the browser, and that's because it doesn't know that this is a server action. So what we should do is just create our own actions folder to put this inside of so we can actually run it as an action. So inside of our app, we'll create an actions folder, and inside of here, I'll create one for post.tsx, or actually just ts, and we'll export a function called delete post. There we go. And at the very top, I'm just going to say use server. And if I really want, I could say delete post action to be super clear that this is particularly an action that is occurring. Now inside of here, I essentially just want to call delete post with a particular post ID. So I'm just going to come into here and I'm going to call that function, make sure that this is asynchronous. And this is going to take in a post ID, which is a string or a number. There we go. And then we'll just import delete post just like that. Now, the nice thing about this function is it'll actually return to us the post that was just deleted, and we can use that to do all the revalidation we want. For example, I can revalidate the post page since we no longer have that post. I can revalidate the users/user ID, so post.user ID, just like that, and this will get rid of the user's information that is being previously saved. And I can also make sure that I revalidate the page for that particular post because it no longer exists anymore, so I want to make sure that I tell Next.js that this page no longer exists. Because if I don't do this, it's going to still render the old post page even though I've deleted it. Now finally, since this page again no longer exists, I should probably just redirect us back to the post page. So I'll say /posts just like that. And I want to make sure I get this redirect from the next/navigation just like that. There we go. So now I can actually use this delete post action instead. And so down here, delete post action. Make sure that I import this just like that. And now everything should be working. So when I click on delete, you'll see it redirects us back to this page and that post is actually deleted. I can do the exact same thing here. Remember, this post is the very first one. If I click view, and then we can go ahead and we can click on delete. And now when it reloads this page, you'll notice that that post has been completely removed. Now, one thing to keep in mind is you noticed how quick everything was loading. That's because I don't have any delay currently inside this file. I'm actually going to add this delay in. So we're just going to add the wait of 2 seconds. And I'm actually going to put this in the code as well that you're going to be using. So you should already have this delay added into your code, but I'm just adding it in myself as well. So that way I can have code that'll look just like yours. So I'm going to add this in after the fact, after I record this video, but it'll be there for you. So now we have that await in there. So now if I were to actually click on this post and click on delete up here, you should notice it's now going to take a much longer time to load. As you can see, I'm waiting, and then finally it actually deletes it and brings me over to this page. So now if we go over to our README, that takes care of delete, edit, and add. So we've done all of that, which may seem like we've done most of the work, but honestly, the loading states and the validation is going to be the hardest part of this entire project. Now, since we're currently dealing with the button for delete right now, let's actually go ahead and add the loading state into this because it's going to be very easy. We just need to take that use transition hook. We can call that. That's going to give us my is pending as well as start transition function. There we go. And what we can do is just wrap this entire thing inside of a start transition, just like that. Make sure that this is the async function. And now what we can do is we can say that this is going to be disabled if it is pending. And we can even change the font here, or the text actually, if we want. So we can say is pending is going to say deleting. Otherwise, it'll say delete. There we go. So now if that worked, when I click delete, you can see it changed my text. It made this actually a disabled button. And then once it finished, it redirected me back to this page. Now, the next thing that we need to work on is going to be the loading state for our new as well as our edit post. So if I click new here, I want to make sure I have a loading state before this page actually loads, as well as most importantly on my edit page, if I click on edit, I want to make sure that if I'm on that edit page that I have a loading state that'll show up, because right now I don't have one. So what I can do is I can create a brand new file called loading.tsx, export default function, loading edit post page. And here I want this to look pretty much exactly the same as our normal post page. So I'll just copy all of this, but instead of rendering out the actual post form, here I want to render out our skeleton post form instead. So I'm going to get that just like this. So now all of a sudden, if I do a hard refresh on this page, you can see that I'm getting the skeleton version of my page. Now you did notice when I do that refresh, there's this error message showing up. If I just go into my skeleton post form, I can remove that error message, and this will actually be removed for you from your source code, so you shouldn't see that. But now when I do a refresh, you can see that everything is looking great, and then I can actually get all my information. Now, one thing you may have noticed if we refresh our page is that the author and the post actually do not load in parallel. You can see that we have to wait a bunch of time after our post loads to get the author information. This is something that I should have included inside the README, but I'm going to add it in as a final bonus here to ensure that post and users load in parallel on the edit post page. Now, this is something we'll come back to because we're currently on step 1 here, and I want to finish doing all of our different loading states. So now if we come into here and go to our app, we're going to go to our post for the edit. You can see we have this loading state right here, which works really well. I'm essentially just going to copy this entire file, paste it into our new folder here, and change this to new post and new post right here. So that way, if we go to our new post page, it'll also give us a loading state here, just in case we have any weird loading going on. Now, the final step to do is to add a loading state to the submit button on our forms, because right now, if we were to edit a post, for example, this one, and I click on the save button, you'll notice I don't get any feedback that this is currently saving, and it's really hard for the user to know that something's happening. So we want to add in that loading state information, and that is going to be happening inside of our components folder inside this post form. So we essentially need to take this button and move it into a client component that is going to be using that hook that is going to get all the information from our post form. Now, if I wanted, I could take this button and move it into a component in a different file and mark that as a client component. But the thing is I'm going to actually need to change this post form to a client component as well in order to add in my error messages and so on. So instead, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to mark this entire file as an error or as a client component. So I'll say use client. And then I'll just need to make a few changes, such as how this user select options is being loaded. For now, I'm just going to comment this out though, so we can come back to this in a little bit. So now let's create that brand new component. We'll say function submit button. There we go. It's essentially just going to return this button right here as is. So let me just make sure I bring this down. There we go. And up here, I'm going to replace this with our submit button. Now the code in this submit button is going to be very simple. We're just going to be using that form status hook. Make sure I get the use form status hook. We want to get the pending flag from here, just like that. And all I want to do is disable my button if it's currently in the pending state. And I also want to just change my text inside of here. So if we are in the pending state, then I want this to say saving. Otherwise, it'll say save just like that. So now everything should be working for that loading state. If I click on edit and I click the save button here, you can see it gives me that saving state, which is exactly what I'm looking for. Now we are getting errors, and that's essentially because I don't have any users being passed along. So that's where my error is coming from, but we can essentially just completely ignore that and we'll refresh to get back to our edit page. So that pretty much takes care of everything related to our loading states that we need to deal with. We both have button loading states as well as actual loading states for our different pages. Now we need to make it so that this user select options works, and we can't just pass these in here because this is no longer a server component, and this is essentially doing server actions in line like this. So instead what we need to do is just pass this in. So here we have our action being passed in. The next thing we need to do is pass in our user select options. So let's go ahead and add that up here. We'll say user select options is a React node. There we go. And now we can just use that down here in place of manually opting into that. There we go. We have those there. Now we just need to make sure we pass this in. So here we can say user select options is equal to user select options. There we go. And I can do the exact same thing on our edit page. So we can come into here, add that in, give it a quick save, make sure I import that. And now hopefully everything is working. You can see here on our edit page, we have all of our options. And if we go to our new page, you can see we also have all of our options right here. If we do a hard refresh, you can see they properly load, which is great. Now, if we look at our README, we've finished up this loading section, and I'm actually going to move down to this third step of loading the post and users in parallel because it essentially deals with the same code. The reason that they're not loading in parallel, if we go to our edit page, is because first we're loading our post and we're waiting for it, and then down here, we're loading our user select options. So if I go to a specific post, click on edit, and I do a hard refresh, you can see it's loading the post, and then it's going to be loading the users after that, which is obviously not ideal. I want to load them both at the exact same time up at the top here. So instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to change this to a promise.all. And this promise.all is going to be taking in get post as well as get users, just like this. So now what's essentially happening is calling both of these at the exact same time, and I'm going to be getting my post as well as my users from here. Then all I need to do is use this users variable for my particular options. So here I'm just going to pass in those users just like this. I'm going to make it so this user select options optionally takes in some users, which by default is going to be equal to nothing. So here I can say users is going to be an optional React, or not React node, I'm sorry, this is going to be a user array. So essentially this is just going to be the return type of get users. So I can say return type of get users, and that's going to be the type of get users. There we go. And also I want to make sure I await this. So we can say the awaited version of that. So essentially it's going to be whatever the promise of get users returns to me. And that's going to be my users object right here, which by default is going to be no value. So then what I can do is I can say, hey, if my users is equal to null, that means I didn't pass any users in. So let's load the users. Otherwise I've already passed them in. So now if I come over to here and I do my hard refresh again, you'll notice it's loading my post, but it's also loading the user at the same time. So you can see they both populate in at exactly the same time. And again, the reason this is working is we're doing a promise.all that runs both of these in parallel and then returns both the data when they're both finished. So the one downside to doing this is that if my users takes longer to load than my post, it'll have to wait for both of those to finish loading before it shows any information. But in our case, they load at the same time, so this is perfectly okay. And then it's just passing that in, so it's using these passed in users instead of the actual users from get users inside of here. So again, it's just making sure it does all the loading at the very beginning instead of pushing it off to the end and doing them in series. So now we're moving on to our final step in our README, which is going to be adding in data validation, both on the client and on the server side. Doing it on the client side is incredibly easy. All I would do is come inside of here and add the required property to all of our different inputs. And that's going to work just fine. So I'm just going to add in that required property here to all these different inputs. There we go. So now if I were to delete this title and I click save, you're going to notice I get an error on the client, which is great. Now I also want to make sure that I don't have these errors on my server as well. So I want to make sure I put these into my server action, just in case there's something that happens where the error gets through past my client. I want to make sure it doesn't actually submit anything. So the easiest way to do that, to make it clean so it's shared across all my different code, is to take these actions that I have and instead move them into my actions folder. So I'm just going to copy this into my actions folder here. I'm going to paste that down, and we're just going to call this edit post action, just like that. I can get rid of the use server in here because it's already defined at the top, and just make sure I bring in that update post. And then let's make sure we export this function. There we go. So now here I can completely remove this and all the different code that it depended on. And instead I can just get the edit post action directly into there. There we go. And it should all still be working fine. So if I change this to say edit and I click save, it should hopefully propagate that information into here to say edit. There we go. It looks like it worked just fine. Let's do the exact same thing with our new page as well. I'm just going to take all of this code, remove it from here, bring it into our actions. So I'm going to export that. We're going to call this create post action. In here, we're going to import create post from our database. There we go. This is all looking good. And now inside of here, I want to get that create post action just like that. And again, now this should be working as well. We get rid of all those extra inputs. And now let's come in here, we'll add a brand new post, click save, and we should see we get redirected to that post page and all the information is being populated just like that. So now let's go ahead and add in the validation. So inside of here, what we can do, I'll just minimize these down. What I essentially want to do is just add validation that's the same between both these. So I'm going to create a function called validate post, and this is going to be taken in my form data, just like that. So then essentially what I can do is at the very top of this, I can just call validate post, and I can pass it in my form data just like that. And essentially what I want this to do is I want it to return me two things. First, I want it to return to me my data, and then I want it to return to me any errors that I have as well. So this data is essentially going to be extracting all this information from our form data, so I don't have to have this duplicated in multiple places. So essentially what that would look like is coming all the way down here and just saying return title, body, user ID, and that's going to be the first thing in my set of parentheses. And if I just return false or like undefined as my error, you can now see it's essentially extracting all this information and putting it into an object. So that way up here, you can see my data is a title, body, user ID, or it's possibly undefined. Now the reason it's saying that it could be undefined is because if I need to do is add as const into here. So now the first thing, my data is always of the type title, body, user ID, and my errors here is always of the type undefined. There we go. That looks like what I want. Now I just want to make sure I actually populate my errors. So I can say my errors is going to start out as an empty object, and I need to give this a specific type. So I'm going to say it's going to have an optional title field, which is a string. It's going to have an optional body field, which is a string, and a user ID field, which is optional and a string as well. There we go. So now what I can do is I can say, hey, if my title is equal to an empty string, well, then I can say my errors.title is equal to just the text required. It doesn't really matter. I can do the exact same thing for my body as well. So I can say if the body is like that, body.equals required. And then here I can do the exact same thing for my user ID, but this one is actually going to be a number. So I can say if it's not a number, then it means that we have some type of error. So here we go. Let's close out of all that. And I'll say that my user ID is required. So now I can actually return my errors as my second property here. And what I want to do is I only want to return my data if there are no errors at all. So what I can do is just say let is valid equal true. And then inside of each of these, I can say is valid equals false, just like that. I could also just check to see if my errors has any keys inside of it. Either way is going to work. It doesn't really matter. But now what I can do is say if it is valid, then return my object. Otherwise, return undefined, just like that. There we go. So now up here, my data could possibly be undefined if I have some type of errors. So now inside of each of my actions, what I can do is I can say, hey, if I don't have any data, for example, my data is equal to null, well then I just want to return whatever my errors are, just like that. Otherwise, I'm going to pass along my data to this particular function. And I can do the exact same thing up here as well. So I'm just going to copy this code up, paste it into here, get my data, get my errors, and then here I'm going to pass in that data. There we go. So now I at least have my error checking going on. I just need to make sure that I pass these errors down. And if you remember correctly, in order to do that, I actually need to use the form state hook. So let's go into my post form, and I want to use that hook all the way at the very top here. So I can say const errors form action is equal to use form state, just like that. And this is going to be taking in the action that I'm going to be using as well as my default state. So my action as well as my default state. Now, if I wanted, I could continue to pass my action in like this, but instead what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to remove the action from my passed in props, and instead I'm going to get my action that I'm going to be using directly from here. So I'm going to say action is equal to, and it's either going to be my create post action, or it's going to be my other form of action, and it's going to be determined on whether or not my post is equal to something. So if my post equals null, then use the create post action. Otherwise, use the edit post action just like this. Now that actually should clean everything up, but we have one problem here. First of all, I need to pass my form action in just like that. The problem is that this action right here doesn't take in the proper properties. And that's because if I go over to my actual actions here, if you remember properly, we need to make sure that not only do we pass in our form data, but we also pass in the previous state, which in our case, we don't really care. So we're just going to type this out as unknown. And I need to make sure I pass this in both my edit and my create post. And that's just because of the way that use form state works. So now we have this previous state being passed in, which is great. The only thing we have left to do is inside of that post form, we make sure that we bind our edit post properly. So I want to bind that post.id as the first property. So we'll say null, then post ID. And it looks like I'm getting a type error, number and string. And that's just because here I typed this particular thing as a string and now it's being passed in as a number. So let's just change that to number and that should work fine. Now here I can remove this action being passed in, remove it from here, and get rid of all these other inputs that are no longer needed. There we go. Same thing here. I get rid of this action as well as the associated import. And it looks like we have no TypeScript errors. So let's make sure our code works as well. If we go to the edit page, I can change this to say edit, click save, and you'll notice it looks like something didn't quite work. Let's make sure that our new post page is also not working. So we'll go to news, type in some information. We'll just call this new, click save. And this looks like it's also not working as well. Now I believe this could be due to caching. So what I'm going to do is just do a hard refresh on this page. That should clear out our cache. And now if I try new and click save, you can see it looks like it is actually working and it's bringing us to a brand new page for that. So let's do edit as well. Again, I'm going to do a hard refresh just to clear out my cache because I believe that was the issue. We'll say that this is the edited title. Now if I click save, we should see that title being propagated inside of this post. There we go, looking great. And if we check our README, you'll notice that actually cleans up everything that we need. We would just need to make sure those required attributes are inside of our HTML as well, and to make sure the errors themselves are working. So let's go to our post form, and let's come in here. I'm going to remove the required attribute from the title. That way, if I edit this, I can test to see if this is working. I'll remove the title, click save, and immediately we're getting an error. This again may be a caching problem, so I'm just going to do a hard refresh on this page just to try this one more time. We're going to remove our title, click save, and we're getting the same error. Now the reason for this is a little bit weird, but it's because we have async here for our function. This should not be an async function. It was part of the before code. I've removed this so you won't have that in your before code. It was just a mistake on my end. But now, hopefully, if we remove our title here and do a quick save, you'll notice it doesn't actually throw any errors, but it also doesn't show us our error messages because we're not using this errors object. So here, I can just say our error message is going to be equal to, and I can just say errors.title. And my errors may not be populated. So we'll say errors.title. There we go. Now, if I give that a quick save, you can see it shows up that that error or that field is required. I can do the exact same thing for our select, but this is our user ID. There we go. And this is going to be going on the form group, just like that. And then I can do the exact same thing if I move down here by pasting that in for my body. So now, if I just go ahead and I remove the required attributes from all of these, we should be able to see those errors. So now if I just remove my body, for example, click save, you can see it says required. And this, it's not possible for me select no option, but if it was, I could click save and it would actually show up. But you can see if I add a title and a body, click save, it's now going to work just fine. There we go. And now I can just add in those final required properties. So I'll come in here, say required. This one will say required. And then finally down here, the text area will be required as well. So now it's going to be fixed on the client as well as on the server. And that is officially everything we need to do for the server actions. Now, the one thing I do want to say is there's a lot of different ways you could have written your code. You could have written your stuff in line like this. You could have passed in your action. You could have created an action folder like I did, or you could have created your actions inside of like your edit post page server component. There's a lot of different ways you can do it, but as long as your code is working and functional and it meets all the requirements from the README, that's really the only thing that matters, because with Next.js and React, there's a ton of different ways to do the exact same thing. And it's really more personal preference and the actual styling and structure of your code that depends on which way that you go. So just because I did it one way and you may have done it a different way doesn't mean my way is right and yours is wrong. They are both correct ways as long as they follow the correct instructions.